Hey friends, welcome back to Snail Story. How's your day going? Is the sun out where you are, or are you wrapped in a rainy breeze? Today's story is about a woman who never expected to be chosen, and a man who thought love had passed him by. It's about two boys who learned to sleep again, not because of magic, but because someone stayed long enough to be their safe place. And it's about a house once full of silence, slowly becoming a home filled with stories, laughter, and lavender in the wind. If you believe that home isn't a place but a person, stay with us till the end. Asterisk. The late-season rain poured relentlessly over the Grant estate. Lightning split the night sky, illuminating the sleek black roof tiles and the cold glass windows on the second floor. Inside the master bedroom, a dim light cast a warm hue over the thick blanket, where three small bodies lay curled up among layers of pillows. Nina Prescott, the 27-year-old nanny, was still awake. Her hand gently patted the back of little Caleb, the younger of the twin boys, while Theo, his older brother by minutes, leaned against her left shoulder, his breathing gradually slowing. Her eyes were dark with exhaustion and worry, but her face held an inexplicable tenderness. She knew this moment was nothing short of a miracle, because for the past 3 months, the boys hadn't slept through a single night, not since their mother died. Not since the nightmares, the screaming fits, the paralyzing anxiety. She had told stories in a whisper, hummed broken lullabies. And finally, it was her presence, unwavering, silent, constant, that allowed the boys to let go. But she never expected that this fragile peace would spark another kind of storm. The bedroom door burst open. "What the hell do you think you're doing in my bed?" The voice was deep and sharp, like stone shattering, echoing from the doorway. Wesley Grant, master of the house, CEO of Grant Holdings, and a widower feared and respected, across the city, stood there. His suit was soaked from the rain, one hand gripping a travel suitcase, but his eyes burned like fire, not with fatigue, but with fury. His gaze locked onto Nina, then shifted to his two sons, sleeping on either side of her. Their arms draped across her body. Nina sat up, startled, unable to hide the panic on her face. "Mr. Grant, I can explain," she whispered, trying to keep her voice calm so the boys wouldn't wake. "Explain?" Wesley stepped into the room, each footstep heavy. "In my bed? Who the hell do you think you are?" Caleb stirred. Theo whimpered. Nina instinctively extended an arm, shielding the children. "They cried for 3 hours. I just stayed until they fell asleep. I didn't do anything wrong." Wesley didn't wait to hear more. His hand flew up, swift and sharp, smack. The slap cracked through the bedroom like a whip cutting across the silence. Nina's head jerked to the side, her balance nearly lost. One cheek flared red, but she didn't cry. She just stared at him, disbelief etched across her face. "You're fired. Get out of my house." His voice was low, cold. She didn't argue, didn't plead. She just looked down at the two sleeping boys, peaceful for the first time in months, and leaned over to kiss Caleb's forehead. Then Theo's, still silent. Then she rose and walked out, barefoot, shoes in hand. He didn't stop her. Downstairs, Mrs. Donnelly, the elderly housekeeper, stood frozen when she saw Nina descending the stairs, her cheek red and a crossbody, bag slung over one shoulder. "Oh my God," she gasped. Nina only shook her head slightly. No words. Then she stepped out into the night, into the rain, the cold, the silence, as if she had never been there at all. Upstairs, Wesley Grant stood frozen in the bedroom, for the first time in months. The silence wasn't terrifying. No crying, no screams. He walked closer to the bed. The boys were still sleeping. No nightmares, no thrashing, no curling up in fear. He stared for a long time, until his throat tightened. 14 people, from child psychologists to high-end nannies, had tried. No one had managed to help the boys sleep. She did, and he had hit her. Wesley sat on the edge of the bed, burying his head in his hands. Shame rose like a tidal wave, drowning every last ounce of pride. On the nightstand, there was a small, folded note. He opened it. "If you can't stay for them, at least don't push away the ones." "Who will?" No signature. But he knew who it was from. Wesley looked at his reflection in the nearby mirror. The face of a failed father. A man so consumed by grief, he could no longer tell who was hurting his children and who was trying to save them. 1 hour later, Nina sat alone at a deserted bus stop. Her cheeks still sore, her hands wrapped around a cup of hot coffee from a vending machine. She hadn't cried when he slapped her, hadn't cried when he fired. Her bed now, sitting in the misty rain, staring at her trembling hands. The tears finally came. An older woman sat down beside her and quietly offered her a tissue. No questions, no judgment, just quiet understanding. Nina nodded in gratitude. She looked up at the gray sky and thought, silently, "I've survived worse. So why does this hurt so much?" She didn't have the answer, but she knew one thing for sure. Those boys had touched something deep inside her, and maybe, just maybe, had touched something inside them too. The next morning, the Grant estate was wrapped in a different kind of silence. Heavier, colder, sadder. Mrs. Donnelly tiptoed as she placed a tray of toast on the table, but no one touched it. The two boys, Theo and Caleb, sat at opposite ends of the long dining table, hair unkempt, eyes vacant, as if they hadn't slept at all. Wesley Grant sat at the head of the table, a cold cup of coffee cradled in his hands. He stared at his sons, not knowing where to begin. "Where's Miss Nina?" Caleb asked, his voice strained like it was dragged out of his throat. Wesley opened his mouth. No words came. "Did she leave because of us?" Theo asked next, his eyes beginning to redden. Wesley shook his head, and this time he managed to speak. "No, it was me." Both boys looked at their father. No blame, just silence. But it was that silence that made Wesley feel smaller than he'd ever felt before. That afternoon, Wesley sat alone in his study, staring at the small folded note Nina had left behind. "If you can't stay for them, at least don't push away the ones who will." In the waning light of day, the words felt like a blade slicing through the empty spaces he thought he'd buried long ago. For the first time in years, Wesley Grant picked up the phone and made a call. Not for business, not for press, not for reputation. He called to ask for a second chance. 3 hours later, a small coffee shop nestled quietly at the edge of the park. Inside, the scent of roasted beans, old wood, and warm pastries mingled in the air. It wasn't loud, it wasn't luxurious, and maybe that's exactly why Nina had chosen it. She sat at the farthest corner, behind a tall fern, her hands slightly trembling as she saw him walk in. Wesley approached, removing his coat, no longer the polished CEO, just a man carrying something that looked a lot like remorse. "Thank you for meeting me," he said softly. Nina nodded. No smile, no small talk, just clarity. Wesley took a deep breath. "I was wrong. Not because I didn't trust you, but because I never learned how to trust." "You don't have to trust me," Nina replied, her voice steadier now. "You just need to trust your children's instincts." Wesley glanced down at the cup of tea in front of her. "I hurt you. Not just with what I did, but with what I failed to do." Nina was quiet for a moment, then spoke slowly. "I didn't stay because I wanted to be praised. I stayed because I knew they needed someone. But I won't come back if everything stays the same." He looked up at her. She continued, "If I return, these are my conditions. Non-negotiable. The conditions? No cameras in the children's rooms. They need to know that privacy is a right, not a privilege. Dinner together, no phones, no assistants. Because meals aren't just about food, they're about connection. Rewrite the house rules with Theo and Caleb involved. Because they are part of this home, not prisoners in it. Wesley nodded slowly after each one. And, Nina added, her voice deeper now, if you ever raise your hand again to anyone who doesn't deserve it, I won't come back. Ever. The wind whispered against the glass in that moment. Wesley Grant was no longer a man of power with thousands of employees. He was a father being offered one last chance. Understood. He said. Nina stood. I'll be back tomorrow morning, 6:30, not earlier, not later. Then she turned and walked away, leaving Wesley Grant still seated, his hand wrapped tightly around a coffee he hadn't even tasted. The next morning, Nina's old beige car pulled up in front of the Grant estate. Harold, the butler, blinked in surprise and then smiled as if letting out a long-held breath. Miss Prescott, he said, welcome back. The moment the door opened, the two boys rushed down the stairs as if they had sensed it. Nina. Caleb shouted. Theo didn't speak. He just hugged her from behind with all his strength. Nina knelt down, smiling softly. Did you miss me? Two heads bobbed in unison like drumming sticks. In Theo's hand was a wrinkled piece of paper, a drawing of 4 figures. Her, the 2 boys, and a big house with a heart-shaped roof. Underneath, written in faded pencil, you stayed, even when you left. 6:30 a.m. sharp, just as promised. Nina Prescott rang the gate bell of the Grant estate. When Harold opened the door, Mrs. Donnelly was already waiting on the steps, still holding a wrinkled apron and an unfinished cup of tea. Nina, she whispered, her eyes slightly misty. You really came back. For the boys, Nina replied, only for them. But as she stepped across the threshold, he felt it too. Something had changed. Not the house to her. Upstairs, soft footsteps echoed down the hallway. Then Caleb appeared at the top of the stairs, hair tousled, still in his dinosaur slippers. He froze when he saw Nina, eyes wide, then broke into a grin that looked almost like tears. You came back. He bolted down the stairs and launched into her arms, holding tight like he'd never let go. Theo followed, quieter. He stopped halfway down, gripping the railing with both hands as if still unsure this was real. Nina looked up at him. You okay? Theo nodded. But that look in his eyes, a mix of question, hurt, and reluctant forgiveness, made Nina's heart ache. I brought you something, Nina said gently, reaching into her coat pocket and pulling out a small package. Wrapped in newspaper, a box of colored pencils. Is the orange one still in there? Theo asked. Yup, she smiled. And the gray one you said looked like rain. Theo gave a soft smile, then stepped down, slowly. When he reached her, he touched her hand lightly. You didn't say goodbye. Nina lowered her head. I didn't know how. Next time, say something, I promise. That morning's breakfast had no clinking silverware on porcelain. No staff standing by. No espresso machine hissing like an office engine instead. They sat at a smaller table tucked in the side kitchen, a scratched old oak table Caleb once said had dragon claw marks. Mrs. Donnelly brought out slightly burnt pancakes with honey drizzling down the plates. Nina poured orange juice. Wesley entered last no suit, just a rolled-up shirt and simple khakis. He looked more human. Good morning, he said, a little awkwardly. Theo didn't respond. Caleb murmured, we started without you. I deserve that. Wesley nodded. He pulled out a chair and sat. For the first time in many months, no one served him, no one brought him the paper. No one plated his breakfast with perfect tea. Symmetry, just 3 other people, land a silence whose direction no one yet knew. After breakfast, Nina led the boys. Upstairs today, we make the rules, she said. House rules. Caleb asked, eyes lighting up. Yep, new ones. The kind that makes sense to us. She rolled out a large sheet of paper and a box of wax crayons. They all sat cross-legged on the floor like they were drawing a treasure map. Let's start with something important, Nina said. What do you wish grown-ups would do? Theo drew a large ear. Listen more, he explained. Caleb drew 2 hands holding each other. No yelling, only holding. Nina sketched a clock and crossed out part of it. No work calls during dinner, she added. Both boys nodded firmly. Can we make hug rules too? Caleb asked. Of course. Ask first, Theo said. Always. The paper slowly filled with drawings and clumsy letters, with scribbled eraser marks and misspellings, but also with something deeper, real listening. Nina leaned back against a chair, watching them proudly as the boys taped the finished family rule sheet to the fridge. Using 2 smiley face magnets, her heart felt lighter, but she knew this was only the beginning. That evening, Wesley appeared at the kitchen doorway, where Nina was rinsing glasses. He carried a leather-bound folder. These are the rules. I used to write for them, he said, placing the folder on the table. Nina dried her hands, picked it up. Read through. No running in the house. No yelling. Bedtime at 8:30. No sweets after 7 p.m. Must ask for permission to leave your room. Sounds like a prison, Nina murmured. He nodded. I know. So what? Do you want now? Wesley let out a breath, honest and heavy. I want to be part of what you're doing, not just watch it from my office. Nina looked up at him. He continued. I don't want to be the man who gives orders anymore. I want to be the man they remember as being there. A few seconds passed in silence. Then Nina pointed toward the new rule sheet taped on the fridge. Rule number 12. She said. Wesley stepped closer. He read Theo's shaky handwriting, scrawled in purple crayon. If you leave, say goodbye, and mean it. He nodded slowly, noted. On the 3rd floor of the Grant estate, there was a door that always remained closed. No name, no room label, and no one in the house ever spoke of it. Mrs. Donnelly had once told Nina that room no one goes in, not even the cleaning staff. Nina hadn't asked further, but one afternoon, while she was helping Caleb make greeting cards out of recycled paper, the little boy suddenly asked, Did you know my mom? The question came as softly as a breath. It had stopped Nina in her tracks. She set the scissors down. No, but I know she was very, very loved. Caleb nodded, then bent back over the paper, cutting silently. A few moments later, he added, Her room is on the 3rd floor. Dad locked it. A long time ago. I heard Grandpa once say, You can't just make it all disappear like that. Nina fell quiet. She knew some rooms weren't locked with keys, but with grief that had no name. That night, when Wesley returned from a business trip, he found the boys asleep on the living room sofa. Nina sat beside them, gently tucking a small blanket over Caleb. The soft lamplight bathed her face, her gaze full of quiet patience. What did you say to help them sleep here? He asked, softly. Nina didn't look up. I told a story about a man who hid a box because he was afraid to look inside. Wesley understood immediately. I know you're talking about that room. She continued. I don't need to know what happened in there, but your boys need one thing, to remember their mother in the most beautiful way possible. Wesley said. Nothing at first. Then quietly, I tried going back in there, twice, but each time I couldn't breathe. Nina didn't push. She stood and quietly stepped out of the room. Wesley watched her go and, for the first time, realized it wasn't the room that was locked. It was him. 3 days later, it was a mild Saturday morning. Sunlight streaming through the branches of the old elm tree in the estate's backyard. Caleb and Theo were kicking a ball when they suddenly heard a faint click from upstairs. Harold, the butler, looked up. That's Miss Charlotte's room, Wesley Grant stood at the third-floor hallway, holding a key he hadn't touched in years. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes no longer turned away. The door creaked open. A thin layer of dust coated everything, but the room remained exactly as it had been the day Charlotte died. Her vanity still held an old bottle of Chanel perfume. The pillowcases were embroidered with C and W. An unfinished novel lay open on the armchair, and a photo crooked on the wall showed Charlotte, Theo, and Caleb at a lakefront summer retreat. Wesley stood there in silence for a long time. Then, slowly, he sat on the wooden chair and picked up the book. Tucked in its crease was a handwritten quote Charlotte had once underlined. "Time doesn't heal. Presence does." Wesley read it again and again, then whispered, "I'm sorry for being gone so long." That afternoon, Nina was watering the garden when Wesley came down the path holding an old wooden box. "I need your help with this," he said gently. Inside the box were the remnants of Charlotte's life photos. Handwritten letters, little keepsakes, and a handkerchief embroidered with a dove. "Charlotte always wanted to teach Caleb how to sew," Wesley said. Nina smiled, softly touching the handkerchief. "Then that's where we'll begin again." That evening, a small ceremony was held in the backyard. No flowers, no wine, just candlelight and memory. Caleb read aloud his first letter to his mother. "I remember you liked apple pie. I asked Miss Nina to teach me how to make it, but the first one got burnt." Theo didn't write a letter. He drew a picture of all four of them, his mom, himself, Caleb, and Nina standing under the apple tree in the yard. Wesley said nothing. He simply placed a family photo into the box, along with a small folded note. "I won't erase the past, but I won't freeze the present because of it either." After the ceremony, Nina and Wesley remained sitting beside the last flickering candle. "Thank you," he said, "for not forcing me to open that door, but simply staying until I was ready." Nina looked at him. "I'm not here to replace anyone. I'm just here to help you and the boys move forward." Wesley nodded. "And I'll learn how to do that bit by bit." She poured him a cup of ginger tea. "We can start," she smiled, "with embroidery lessons." Wesley chuckled. "I can't even sew a button straight." "Then I'll teach you." Wesley sat in his office, a thick accounting report open in front of him. Bold headings, budget graphs, and a flood of numbers danced across the screen. But his eyes stopped at a short sentence at the bottom of the page. "Proposal, withdraw. Funding from Hawthorne-Williams Center no longer provides expected PR or media value." He pressed his fingers to his temple. The Hawthorne-Williams Center, once Charlotte's passion project, now a lifeline for over 80 children who had been abused, abandoned, or rejected, was being reduced to a line item, a decision marked no longer profitable in terms of image. "Damn it," he whispered. That evening, while Nina was helping Caleb and Theo paint wooden picture frames, an activity brought home from the center, Wesley walked in, a file folder in hand. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. Nina glanced at his expression, then nodded. "Double quotes, boys. Finish the painting yourselves, all right? And try not to spill it on the couch." In the first-floor library, Wesley handed her the folder. "I need to make a decision within the week." "About what?" "Cutting funding for the Hawthorne-Williams Center." Nina was silent. He continued, "I know how cold that sounds, but the board is pressuring me. They want to restructure, redirect funds toward projects with better returns." "Returns?" Her voice was quiet, but firm. "What return is greater than saving a child's life?" Wesley looked at her. "I don't want to do this. But if I don't propose a viable financial solution, the center will be eliminated by default." Nina didn't respond right away. Instead, she walked over to a bookshelf, pulled out a small wooden box, the one where she kept letters, drawings, and photos from the children who'd come through the center. She placed it on the table, opened it. "I don't know how to write reports," she said, but I do know these are the numbers that truly matter. A crayon drawing of a house with the words, "This is the safest place." A photograph of a boy who hadn't spoken in 2 years, now giving a speech in front of his class. A scribbled note, "Miss Nina was the first person who hugged me without being afraid." Wesley was still. Nina continued, "If I need to give a presentation, I will. If I need to learn PR, I'll learn. But if I need to fight for this place, I won't back down." He asked quietly, "Why are you so devoted to that place?" She looked him straight in the eyes. "Because I used to be the child no one chose." 2 days later, Nina stood before the executive board of Hawthorne Industries, giving a short presentation. She wore a simple dress, her hair in a neat bun, and held only a small stack of notes. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "I'm not here to ask for money. I'm here to remind you why Mr. Wesley's wife, Charlotte, created that center in the first place." Then she told stories of the first little girl Charlotte ever helped a child who hid under desks because she was terrified of adult voices, of the first quilt Wesley ever donated back when he still believed this will all be over soon, of herself, once a girl who survived violence, who found shelter at the center, started as a library assistant, and worked her way up to lead community therapy. The room was utterly silent. When she finished, no one clapped, only one director. Mrs. Lewis stood up and said, "I used to think it was a sentimental project. Now, see, it's a model that can change an entire generation." That evening, Wesley found Nina at the center's library, doing inventory of donated books. "I just got the email," he said. "The funding's been preserved. It won't be cut." Nina exhaled. "Good." He lingered for a moment, then added gently, "Thank you for teaching me that not everything needs data to prove its worth." Nina smiled softly. "Then thank you for listening. Really listening." Wesley looked at her, then asked, almost unexpectedly, "Nina, aside from the center and the boys, is there anything you're afraid to lose?" She hesitated, then answered, lightly, but with meaning, "People don't fear losing what they never had. But once you start to feel like you belong somewhere, then when it gets scary." Wesley didn't ask anything else. He simply stood there, among old bookshelves, bathed in the soft glow of yellow light, facing a woman once abandoned, now saving countless children from the same fate. It was a quiet, windless autumn afternoon. Nina stood beneath the awning of the community center, a cup of ginger tea warming her hands as she watched the children playing tag in the yard. A few steps away, Wesley leaned against the railing, hands in his pockets, his gaze steady and silent. They didn't speak, but in the hush between them, something was shifting slowly and quietly, like the first leaf falling onto the red brick path. "I always thought you were the kind of person who's really good at moving forward," Nina said first, still watching the kids. Wesley turned slightly, brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "You always seem to know what you want, what to do, eh? And you never show anything you don't want to." He chuckled. "That just means I'm good at hiding it." "And I'm good at running," Nina replied, her voice light as the breeze. "I don't know how to stay." Wesley didn't speak, but he didn't look away either. "When I was little," she continued, "I lived in a house with 3 locks on the door, but none of them could lock out my father's drunken shouting my mom. Left when I was 7. After that, I lived with 4 different foster families. Every one of them had an expiration date." He said nothing. She didn't stop. "Once, I thought I could actually stay. My foster mother taught me how to bake. She gave me a red dress for Christmas, but then she died in a car accident. After that, someone said, 'That girl brings bad luck.'" Nina smiled. Kinda smile worn by someone who's had to swallow too many tears. "So when I grew up, I decided not to let anyone get too close. I don't say I love you. I don't make promises, and I never let anyone see me when I'm weak. Wesley took a quiet breath. Have you ever told anyone this before? No one ever asked. That night, Wesley invited Nina into the estate's library. Warm light glowed from the overhead lamps, illuminating the oak bookshelves. On the table sat 2 glasses of red wine, the first time he'd invited her. For something that had nothing to do with work. If you weren't working at the center, he asked, breaking the silence, what would you want to do? Grow flowers, Nina answered. Open a little plant shop in a quiet town. I'd name it Second Breath. Wesley smiled. Sounds like a poem. And you? I used to want to be a musician, he said, surprised by his own answer. But I followed the path my parents wanted. Now I still play sometimes when no one's around. Nina tilted her head. Maybe one day you'll play for someone, he replied. Maybe. It was just one word, but in the stillness of that night, it held a kind of softness, a quiet reach. The next morning, Nina arrived at the center earlier than usual. She wanted to reorganize the children's reading room. When she stepped inside, she found an old piano placed near the window, a small note resting on top for second breath. Someone should play a song otherwise. This room will get too lonely. She smiled and gently pressed one key. It rang slightly off, but warm. That evening, after Caleb and Theo had gone to bed early, Nina sat on the front porch, gazing up at the stars. Wesley joined her and took a seat beside her. That piano belonged to Charlotte, he said. She didn't want to leave it in the bedroom. She was afraid it would become just another thing to dust. Nina looked at him. And now you brought it to the center. Because someone made me realize that the things we hold Antwoff placed in the right hands can still find new life. A beat of silence. Then he turned to her, his expression suddenly serious. Asterisk, Nina. I don't want to rush anything, but if someday I tell you that I want you to stay now for the job, not for the boys, but for you, then what? She asked gently. Would you run? Nina lowered her gaze. Her fingers curled slightly around the wooden armrest. I don't know, she whispered. But for the first time, I think I want to learn how not to run. Wesley didn't say anything more, but he reached over and gently placed his hand over hers, like someone testing whether an old wound had finally healed, and Nina didn't pull away. It was a quiet Friday afternoon when Nina was organizing books in the reading room of the community center. That's when a stranger appeared at the door, wearing a worn leather jacket, with pale gray eyes and a twisted smile that looked like an old wound that never healed. Nina Prescott, he said, still using that name. She froze. Her breath caught in her chest. Hello, Dean. Dean Riley, Nina's first boyfriend. Also the one who had led to her leaving her last foster home and disappearing for nearly 2 years. He walked into the room like he owned it, glancing around with mocking eyes. Nice setup, little library. Well-behaved kids who would have guessed you'd play the saint after everything that happened. Nina stayed calm. What do you want? Money? A job? Or I start telling the real story about you? Her fists clenched. There is no real story. There's what you daddened, the fact that I survived it. Dean smirked. Is that so? I bet the people who trust you now, especially that billionaire of yours, would love to hear the rest. That night, Nina went to see Wesley. He was playing the piano in the living room. She entered so quietly that he didn't notice at first. Wesley. He looked up and immediately saw something was wrong. What happened? She told him everything. About Dean. About the past. About the running. The coercion. The part of her that had gotten lost. I don't know if you'll still want me here, she finished. Wesley was silent for a long moment. Then he stood, walked over to her, and said, You think I love you because you don't have scars? She was stunned. I love you because you're still standing despite every one of them. For the first time, Wesley called her you in a way that sounded like us. The next morning, Wesley arrived at the center with a lawyer. He found Dean in the courtyard, casually smoking like he owned the place. "Mr. Riley," Wesley said, voice steady, "I've reviewed your background. 3 charges for assault, 2 prior civil suits. If you don't leave this city within 24 hours, I'll file for criminal charges for blackmail and harassment." Dean sneered. "I could mess up everything for you. There's nothing left to mess up," Wesley cut in. "I've made my choice. I chose Nina. She chose courage. You chose cowardice." Dean walked away. That night, Nina stood in the garden, holding an old photograph, one of her and her late foster mother, before she passed. The woman had written in her journal, "I hope someday she meets someone patient enough to believe in the best parts of her." Wesley joined her, reaching out his hand. She placed hers in his. "I'm not afraid of you knowing my past," she said. "I'm afraid that once you know it, you'll see me differently." Wesley shook his head gently. "I don't see you differently. I just want to stay even more." That evening, as Nina was getting Theo and Caleb ready for bed, the 2 boys ran toward her, hugging their pillows. "Miss Nina, will you tell us a story tonight?" Caleb asked, eyes sparkling. "Tell the one about the cat climbing on the roof." "Then falling into the flower pot," Theo added. Nina laughed and nodded. "All right then. Tonight's story will be about a cat that learned to fly." She sat between the boys on the warm bed, the soft glow of the nightlight casting star-shaped patterns across the ceiling. When she reached the part that said, "The little cat fell, but was caught by a warm pair of arms," Caleb turned to her and asked, "Just like your arms, right, Miss Nina?" Her heart clenched, and for a moment she didn't know how to answer. After the boys had fallen asleep, Nina tiptoed downstairs in the living room. Wesley was reviewing a new layout for the community center. He looked up when she entered. "They asleep." "Fast asleep, and you're still working?" He nodded, but then pushed the design aside. "Want to go for a walk?" They strolled through the garden behind the estate, once an overgrown patch of neglect after Charlotte's death, revived, with green grass, bougainvillea vines, and the faint scent of lavender in the night air. "I'm redesigning the whole center," Wesley said. "Not just a place for kids to learn and play BAT somewhere. Parents, teachers, and people with wounds of their own can come to heal." Nina stopped and looked at him. "That's not just a center, Wesley. That's the part of your heart that's still standing after everything." He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "And what about you? Is your heart staying too?" She pressed her lips together, then said softly, "Maybe for the first time, I'm not counting the days until I leave." The next morning, Wesley took all 3, Nina, Theo, and Caleb, to a small bakery in town. It was the first time he let them go out together like a family. The shop owner, kind old woman named Edith, looked at them and smiled. Such a beautiful family. The boys looked just like their father. Both Wesley and Nina instinctively opened their mouths to clarify. But Caleb beat them to it. "Miss Nina's not our mom, but I wish she was." Nina turned bright red. Wesley looked at her with a gaze that was warm, quiet, and said everything without a word. That evening, after dinner, Wesley suggested a game. "Let's each say one thing that makes us feel we're home." Caleb said, "Home is when there's Miss Nina's garlic toast," Theo added, "and the smell of Dad's winter coat." Wesley turned to Nina. "And you?" She smiled. "Home is when you remember Divin if you don't say a word." He nodded slowly. "I feel the same, and when someone doesn't leave." In that moment, no one said it aloud. But Nina was no longer a guest. She belonged to this home. Late at night, as she passed through the hallway, Nina spotted Wesley at the piano. He was playing a soft melody, the early notes of a song he had once started writing in his youth and never finished. She stood silently behind him. When the music ended, he turned around. "I call that one Stay." Nina whispered, "Who did you write it for?" Wesley looked at her, his eyes holding the quiet ache of a winter beginning to melt. "Now, for you?" That morning, a letter from the Vincent Hale Foundation arrived on Wesley's desk. "We would like to expand your model, the Grant Prescott Center, nationwide." Vincent wrote, "The project will be based in New York. You have 3 days to consider." Wesley held the letter in his hands, heart stirring with emotion. This was the dream he once shared with Charlotte, to scale their healing model into a national support system for children across the country. But now, Charlotte was gone, and the person beside him was Nina and those 2 little boys. They only slept well now when she read them bedtime stories. Nina, too, received an email from Dr. Helen Brooks, a program director who had once visited the center. "We'd like to invite you to be a senior advisor for the Community Recovery Initiative in Chicago. A stable position, high pay, and a chance to make an even bigger impact." She read the message again and again, but her eyes kept drifting to the photo on the bookshelf. Wesley, Theo, and Caleb, smiling under the apple tree. They had never said, "I love you." But the way Wesley looked at her was like the only light in a house that had been dark for far too long. That afternoon, Wesley took Nina to a lavender field just outside town. It was where he had once built a small wooden bridge for Charlotte. Now, he had rebuilt it, sturdier, with railings on both sides. "I used to dream of walking across this bridge with the person I love," Wesley said, voice low. Nina stayed quiet. The late afternoon wind carried the gentle scent of purple blooms. "And now," he continued, "I want to know if I choose to stay here. If I turn down the national project, will you choose to stay too, with me? For good?" Nina exhaled softly. "Wesley, I'm not asking if you love me," he interrupted gently. "I just want to know, would you choose us?" Nina looked at him for a long time. "What about you?" she asked. "Will there ever be a part of you that regrets giving this up?" Wesley smiled faintly. "Maybe. But if I lose you, I know I'll regret that more." That night, Wesley sat in his study. He tore the letter from the Vincent Hale Foundation in half, then opened his laptop and typed a simple reply. "I choose to stay, because a place for healing can't be born from leaving." At the same time, Nina replied to the offer from Chicago. "Thank you for the opportunity, but my heart has already found where it's needed most." The next morning, when Theo and Caleb woke up, Nina was in the kitchen flipping pancakes. "Miss Nina, are you going anywhere today?" Caleb asked. She smiled. "I'm right here, for good." The boy squealed with joy, running off to find Wesley. "Dad, Miss Nina said she's not going anywhere." Wesley just smiled. His eyes found hers quietly, deeply. That evening, the 4 of them sat in the backyard, stringing lights between the trees and the porch. Wesley quietly pulled out a chair for Nina and motioned for her to sit. "I have a question," he said, placing his hand on the table. "What is it?" "Tomorrow, if I drop the kids off at school, could you be the one to pick them up?" Nina laughed, thinking he was joking, but his eyes said otherwise. "And one day, if they ever have a mother again, could that be you?" She didn't answer with words. She simply reached out and held his hand. The summer festival at the Grant Prescott Center took place on a warm day in early June. Colorful string lights stretched from the old oak tree to rows of long wooden tables, where kids painted figurines, decorated cookies, and chased each other around newly planted flower beds. On a small stage made from reclaimed wood, Wesley Grant stepped up, microphone in hand. His gaze settled on the front row, where Nina sat with Theo and Caleb. She wore a pale blue dress, her hair tied back neatly, her smile gentle, her eyes glistening. "1 year ago," Wesley began. his voice steady and sincere. This center was just an empty building, and the three of us, my sons and I, were just names under the same roof, not truly reaching one another. I thought I could get through the rest of life with duty and fading memories. And then she came quietly. With trying to fix anything, she was simply present, and that presence changed everything. He turned slightly, looking at Nina. The crowd fell silent for a moment. Some nodded, touched. Those who knew their story understood this wasn't just gratitude. It was a confession, a declaration of love in the only language a once broken man knew how to speak. When the applause broke out, the two boys jumped to their feet, shouting, "He's talking about Miss Nina!" And the whole crowd burst into laughter. That evening, after the party ended, Wesley asked Nina to take a walk. Through the garden, they passed the small wooden bridge behind the center, once a place where Wesley had stood alone during sleepless nights. A place tied to memories of the woman he had lost. But tonight, he stopped, placed a hand on the railing, and turned to Nina, his eyes more peaceful than ever before. "I used to believe no one could ever replace her," he said, "and maybe that's still true. But now I understand, life doesn't ask us to replace anyone. It asks us to open our hearts again, to love differently, to love newly." He reached into his pocket and took out a small velvet box. Nina said nothing, but her eyes welled with tears. Inside was a simple silver ring, no diamond, no glitter, just one engraved word: stay. "I don't need you to promise you'll love me forever," Wesley said gently. "I just need you to choose to stay with us every day." Nina didn't speak. She simply nodded. No hesitation. No pretense, just one nod enough to change the world. Behind her, 3 weeks later, they were married in the backyard of the center, the same garden space Wesley and Nina had once restored with the help of the kids. There were no reporters, no extravagant parties, just friends, the children who had found safety in the center, and a few neighbors who had quietly witnessed the journey of these three souls. Nina wore a simple white dress, hand-sewn by the single mothers in her sewing class. She held a bouquet of lavender, the first flower she and Wesley had planted together by the reading room window. As she walked in, the sound of the piano filled the airstay, played by Wesley himself. When the minister asked, "Do you vow to stay not just in this home, but in all the seasons of each other's lives?" Wesley smiled. "I do." And Nina, her voice unwavering, replied, "I already have." After the wedding, they moved into the old house, but everything had changed. The living room now bathed in sunlight. Filled with shelves Nina had carefully curated, and a cozy reading nook for children's story time. A small room became Caleb's art corner. The balcony became Theo's writing spot, where he spent hours cloud-watching and scribbling down his made-up stories. In the yard, Wesley replanted cucumbers, tomatoes, and built a new lavender bed. So if you're ever sad, there's always a little soft scent waiting. Every night, Nina told bedtime stories not as the manager, not as the nanny, but as Mom, the mother the boys had chosen and who had chosen them. Right back. As for Wesley, he didn't need to hold Nina's hand constantly, but his eyes always sought her in every room. In their silences, there was something unbreakable, something understood. One quiet night, after the boys had fallen asleep, Nina sat by the window and opened her journal. She wrote about the wooden bridge, the silver ring with no sparkle, a man who had once been broken, and 2 children who had once been lost, and how they had chosen one another not because they were perfect, but because they had stayed. She ended the final line with 3 words: "This is home." Sometimes healing doesn't come in grand gestures. It comes in the quiet, in someone making pancakes in the morning, in a silver ring with one simple word: stay. In choosing to love, not because it's perfect, but because it's real. Thank you for listening to this story till the end. It touched something in your heart. Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow Snail's story for more gentle tales of love, healing, and home. See you in the next story.